Welcome. This chapter covers the turbulent period from 977 to 887 before the Common Era, when the United Kingdom of Israel fractured and the history of the separate northern and southern kingdoms unfolded. Following the death of Solomon, his son Rehoboam ascended the throne. The northern tribes, dissatisfied with heavy taxation and centralized rule, supported the return of Jeroboam. At Shechem, a pivotal city, the 10 northern tribes seceded, electing Jeroboam as their king, thus creating the northern kingdom of Israel, while Judah and Benjamin remained under Rehoboam in the south. Jeroboam established idolatrous worship centers to secure loyalty, drawing the rebuke of the prophet Ahijah. Meanwhile, Judah maintained traditional worship and experienced a line of kings, including Abijam, Asa, and subsequent rulers such as Nadab and Baasha. Asa's reign included wars with Baasha and victories over invaders like Zerah, while diplomatic challenges arose with Aramean kings such as Ben-Hadad. The northern kingdom faced rapid succession and instability with kings like Elah, Zimri, and Omri. Omri consolidated power, built Samaria as the new capital, and strengthened alliances with Ethbal and the city-state of Tyre. His successor, Ahab, is remembered for both political skill and moral failure, particularly influenced by his wife Jezebel and the introduction of Baal worship. The prophet Elijah emerges as a central figure, confronting idolatry, most famously in the contest at Mount Carmel, and exposing injustices such as the seizure of Naboth's vineyard. Conflicts with Aramean kings continued, while alliances with Judah shaped regional politics. The period concludes with significant upheavals, including the reigns of Ahaziah, Jehoram, and the rise of Elisha, culminating in the dramatic purge led by Jehu and the death of Jezebel, marking a violent transformation of Israel's northern kingdom. For the first time since the establishment of the monarchy in Israel, the heir to the throne could ascend without challenge or dispute. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, was more fortunate than both his father Solomon and his grandfather David, for when he took the throne in 977 before the Common Era, he inherited a realm that was mighty, prosperous, and respected among the nations. Tribes and rulers from surrounding territories bowed in allegiance to him, offering an opportunity for the young king to indulge in grand visions of power and happiness. His undisputed succession may have been secured because he had no brothers to contest the crown, or because the strict laws of Solomon regarding property and succession left no room for dispute. Whatever the cause, Rehoboam ascended the throne smoothly, unlike the tumultuous period following David's death. The disputes over succession that had marked the reign of David did not recur, for Rehoboam lacked both the character and the capability to instigate or withstand such contests. He was not gifted with strength, courage, or intelligence. He was thoughtless, haughty, and without self-reliance. Neither warlike nor inclined to appreciate the responsibilities of rulership, he expected the throne to secure for him power, peace, and comfort. But this illusion was soon shattered by forces he could not control, forces that would rob him of authority and forever divide the nation of Israel. Jeroboam, an Ephraimite nobleman, had already attempted rebellion in the latter years of Solomon's reign. After his failed bid, he had fled to Egypt, seeking refuge from Solomon's vigilance. Upon receiving news of Solomon's death, Jeroboam returned to Israel with renewed ambition, intending to resume the schemes that had been sanctioned by the prophet Ahijah. It is likely that he received support from Shishak, king of Egypt, who provided safe passage by sea to the Israelite port. Jeroboam's arrival in Shechem, a city of secondary importance but situated strategically in the heart of the northern tribes, immediately inspired unrest. The Shechemites, historically restless and prone to sedition, seized the opportunity to revolt. Jeroboam either instigated or accepted the invitation to lead an assembly of the people, convened to discuss measures to achieve their objectives without resorting to bloodshed. Elders from the other tribes were invited to participate, giving the uprising the appearance of a national movement rather than a local insurrection. The first decisive step in this rebellion was to refuse to travel to Jerusalem to pledge allegiance to the new king, as had been customary. Instead, it was decided that Rehoboam himself would be invited to Shechem to receive the allegiance of the tribes. This calculated act of defiance placed Rehoboam in a situation that would prove catastrophic, a moment of high drama with consequences that would reverberate through Israel for centuries. Rehoboam traveled to Shechem with his council, composed of elder statesmen who had served Solomon and younger advisers whom he personally trusted. Among his retinue was Adoniram, the overseer of forced labor, whose presence and authority ensured compliance among the workers and servants. Upon reaching Shechem, the representatives of the tribes presented their grievances to the king. Jeroboam, appointed as their spokesman, addressed Rehoboam boldly, "Thy father laid upon us a heavy yoke, and imposed harsh burdens. If thou wilt lighten the yoke, we will serve thee willingly." The young king, though inwardly angry at their audacity, feigned patience and asked them to return in 3 days for his response. During this interval, he sought counsel. The older advisers urged leniency, advising him to show mercy and wisdom, but the younger men argued for severity, urging him to demonstrate the strength of his authority. Rehoboam, lacking judgment and prudence, followed the advice of the younger counselors. When the elders returned, he responded with words of scorn and intimidation. "My little finger is stronger than my father's loins. If he chastise you with rods, I will chastise you with scorpions." Jeroboam, anticipating no other reply, turned to the elders and declared, "What share have we in David, and what inheritance in the son of Jesse? Return to your tents, O Israel, and let David govern his own house." With these words, the northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, openly renounced Rehoboam's rule. Jeroboam unfurled the banner of rebellion, and the people of Shechem rallied willingly to his cause, signaling the permanent secession of 10 tribes from the house of Judah. The division of Israel had begun, a fracture that would shape the destiny of the nation and set the stage for centuries of conflict, rival kingdoms, and enduring enmity between the northern and southern realms. All the jealousy and hatred that the Ephraimites had harbored during the reigns of King David and King Solomon, stemming from the burdens, forced labor, and perceived humiliations they had endured, now erupted with full force. They seized the opportunity to free themselves from the rule of Rehoboam, son of Solomon, and to assert control over the northern tribes as they had done during the period of the judges, when Israel had no centralized monarchy. Sword in hand, the inhabitants of Shechem, a city in the territory of Ephraim, led by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, attacked the palace in which King Rehoboam resided. Rehoboam sent Adoniram, the overseer of the forced laborers, to punish the ringleaders as one would punish rebellious slaves. But the Ephraimites overwhelmed him with a shower of stones, and Adoniram fell dead at the scene. Alarmed and fearing for his own life, Rehoboam fled from Shechem in his royal chariot and returned to Jerusalem, the capital city. In a single day, a breach had occurred in the unity of the kingdom, one that no immediate force could repair. Deeply troubled and humiliated by the rebellion, Rehoboam sought to determine the loyalty of the remaining tribes. He pondered whether the tribes closest to Jerusalem might be inspired by the example of the Shechemites to renounce their allegiance as well. Yet he was relieved to discover that the tribe of Judah, intimately tied to the house of David and protective of its honor, remained steadfast. The tribe of Simon, closely allied with Judah, followed suit, and the tribe of Benjamin, sharing kinship and territory with Judah, also remained loyal. With these tribes supporting him, Rehoboam could have attempted to suppress the rebellion by military force, but Jeroboam acted swiftly to consolidate the secession. Jeroboam convinced the Ephraimites that only a king could protect them from the anticipated retaliation of Rehoboam. They then resolved to establish a rival monarchy, and the elders of Ephraim, joined by the other northern tribes, anointed Jeroboam as king. Their allegiance to him was reinforced by long-standing grievances against the house of David, from which they expected no redress. Thus Jeroboam, a previously obscure man from the town of Zereda, became ruler over 10 tribes of Israel, reigning from 977 to 955 before the Common Era. The 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin, along with Simon, remained faithful to the house of David, though Simon was largely merged into Judah. The fragile unity of Israel, barely a century old since David had consolidated it, was again sundered. Both kings sought to secure their positions through alliances to prevent further conflict. Rehoboam forged a treaty with the king of Damascus, a state founded by Rezan, a former bandit who had risen to power during Solomon's reign, and whose successor, Taberman, had united several Aramean districts under Damascus. This alliance deterred Jeroboam from invading the southern kingdom of Judah. Jeroboam, meanwhile, pursued alliances of his own to strengthen his position and challenge the authority of Rehoboam. The division between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah reflected centuries of historical differences. The northern tribes, especially Ephraim, willingly sacrificed the advantages that might have come from unification under the house of David to preserve their independence and resist subordination. Leaders in both kingdoms likely lamented the split but were powerless to prevent it. A civil war, though imminent, was temporarily forestalled by the prophet Shemaiah, who, speaking in the name of the God of Israel, called upon the Judeans and Benjamites to cease fraternal bloodshed. Small skirmishes occurred between the neighboring kingdoms, but none escalated into major conflict. Jeroboam received significant support from Shishak, also known as Sheshink, the king of Egypt. It is said that Shishak strengthened Jeroboam's position by marrying his wife's elder sister Anna to a fugitive Israelite, just as he had earlier married another sister to an Idumean prince seeking refuge. Shishak may also have supplied Jeroboam with money, enabling him to return to Israel and consolidate his rule. Consequently, Rehoboam was constrained from taking decisive action against the northern kingdom. To protect Judah and Jerusalem from potential attacks by Jeroboam and Egypt, Rehoboam constructed a network of fortresses encircling the capital city. Yet, these defenses proved inadequate when, in the 5th year of his reign, 972 before the Common Era, Shishak launched a military campaign against Judah. Facing overwhelming Egyptian forces, the fortified cities fell one by one. Shishak advanced to Jerusalem itself, which capitulated without resistance. The Egyptian king seized the treasures that Solomon had amassed, including the gold and silver stored in the palace and the temple, as well as the golden shields and spears used by the king's guards in ceremonial processions. Despite this loss, Shishak left the political structure of Judah intact, allowing Rehoboam to remain on the throne, though humiliated and diminished in resources. After returning from his campaigns, King Shishak of Egypt commemorated his military prowess and victories over the land of Judah and other districts with monuments and records, proclaiming in stone and inscription the magnitude of his triumphs. The brief alliance between King Solomon of Israel and the king of Egypt thus came to an abrupt end. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, learned from this event the fragility of political treaties and the limits of trust, even when they appeared carefully calculated and well conceived. Solomon, despite his renowned wisdom, had acted thoughtlessly in uniting himself by marriage to the daughter of Pharaoh. He had built her a luxurious palace, yet within a few years after Solomon's death, an Egyptian king would ransack this very palace and other monumental structures erected under Solomon's reign, plundering their treasures. The grandeur and power of Solomon's kingdom, once unparalleled in the region, had come to an abrupt decline. Meanwhile, Jeroboam, the ambitious son of Nebat and former servant of Solomon who had fled to Egypt, seized the opportunity to consolidate his power. He fortified the city of Shechem, constructing for himself a palace that also served as a citadel, or armen, for defense. On the eastern side of the Jordan River, he strengthened other towns, including Peniel, known also as Peniel, establishing these as barriers against possible attacks from the south, where the Moabites and Ammonites had already separated from Israelite control. Even the Idumeans, long subdued under the Judeans, had thrown off the yoke of Solomon's successors. Jeroboam faced a pressing internal problem. The families of the northern tribes, guided by habit or devotion, continued to make annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem during the autumn harvest to take part in the worship of the invisible God at the temple built by Solomon. This loyalty to the southern capital, even if limited to a portion of the people, alarmed Jeroboam. He feared that if the population increasingly repaired to Jerusalem, they might reunite with the house of David, threatening his recently acquired throne. To prevent this, he conceived a cunning and wicked plan, one that would draw Israel back into idolatry while securing his own authority. During his extended stay in Egypt, Jeroboam had observed the Egyptian system of worship, particularly the reverence for animals, especially the bull, which served to control the population and support despotic governance. He saw in these rituals a political tool, capable of blunting the nation's critical faculties and strengthening his own power. Jeroboam, in consultation with his advisers, resolved to introduce similar practices among the 10 tribes of Israel. He believes that the worship of symbolic representations of God would maintain the nation's loyalty while simultaneously securing Egypt's favor, since the religious customs would align with those of his host country. His familiarity with Egyptian habits was also reinforced by his probable marriage to an Egyptian princess, a union linking him directly to the royal house of Egypt. Jeroboam took practical steps to enforce this new worship. At Bethel, a city in the southern part of his kingdom, and at Dan, located in the far north, he erected golden calves and proclaimed, "This is thy God, O Israel, who brought thee out of Egypt." At Bethel, he established a large temple and installed a sacrificial altar, intending to preside personally over the ceremonies. To further weaken the pull of Jerusalem, he shifted the Feast of Ingathering, traditionally held in the 7th month, to the 8th month. thereby preventing the people from attending the festival at the temple in Jerusalem. He may have also altered the calendar, adopting a longer solar reckoning rather than the shorter lunar year followed in Judah. The people of Israel, for the most part, did not resist these changes. They viewed the golden calves and new rituals as a continuation of ancient practices, and the unity of God remained doctrinally intact. Jeroboam had not introduced polytheism, but merely provided visible incarnations of the deity, symbols of strength and fruitfulness. For a people naturally inclined to the pleasures of the senses, the tangible presence of these symbols was gratifying. The spirituality of God, abstract and unseen, was more difficult for them to grasp than the notion of his unity expressed in concrete form. Unlike the Canaanite worship of Baal, this new ritual did not outrage the moral conscience of the population. Over time, the people grew accustomed to attending the high festivals at Bethel or Dan, while continuing to make offerings at home or at local shrines where sacrifices had previously been offered. Jeroboam's plan succeeded. The population became stultified, obedient, and reliant on him. Yet the tribe of Levi, devoted to the teachings of the prophet Samuel, remained independent. No Levite would serve as priest in the worship of the golden calves. To solve this problem, Jeroboam took any volunteer willing to assume the priestly role. On occasion, he performed the priestly duties himself, perhaps to lend prestige to the new ceremonies or an imitation of Egyptian custom. In this way, step by step, he undermined the original principles of Judaism and solidified his control over the northern kingdom. Even as Jeroboam imposed these religious innovations, the old prophet Ahijah of Shiloh, who had previously guided Jeroboam toward insurrection, was too frail to oppose him openly. Nevertheless, when Jeroboam's wife visited Ahijah to inquire about the grave illness of her eldest son, the prophet seized the opportunity to foretell the eventual dissolution of Jeroboam's royal house. Despite this warning, the necessity of self-preservation compelled Jeroboam to maintain the new system of worship, which endured throughout the existence of the kingdom of the 10 tribes. None of Jeroboam's successors dared to alter it, assuring that his religious and political reforms would shape the northern kingdom for generations to come. In the kingdom of Judah, also called the house of Jacob, the circumstances were starkly different from those in the northern tribes. Politically weakened by the secession of the 10 tribes and by repeated incursions from Egypt under Pharaoh Shishak, Judah bore wounds too deep to heal quickly. Yet in matters of religion and morality, the kingdom had not fallen entirely. Rehoboam, son of King Solomon, appeared indifferent to moral or religious governance. Pride, once wounded, had left him idle, indifferent to the welfare of his people. So, the temple in Jerusalem and the Levites, who served as priests and custodians of religious law, acted as a stabilizing influence, preserving order and ritual. Public religious life largely mirrored the practices established under King Solomon. High altars, or behemoth, maintained by families throughout the year, continued to function, and the people still gathered at the temple for the autumn festivals. Deviations from established worship were rare and generally confined to the inner court of the palace, where the women of the royal household might indulge in rituals for foreign deities. Rehoboam's mother, Maachah, herself a descendant of Absalom, favored the worship of Astarte, a Canaanite goddess, and had erected a statue in her palace, maintaining temple priestesses. Though Rehoboam allowed these innovations, they never spread widely. Despite the absence of widespread idolatry, the people showed no movement toward higher moral or spiritual development. A sense of decay seemed to settle over the kingdom, and it would take nearly 2 centuries before a higher spiritual energy again appeared. Rehoboam's reign of 17 years remained inglorious. His son Abijam, ruling from 960 to 958 BCE, followed in similar fashion, indulging in minor hostilities against Jeroboam, the king of the northern tribes, without any decisive outcomes. Abijam permitted his mother Maachah's idolatrous practices to continue and died young, leaving no heirs. He was succeeded by his brother Asa, who reigned from 957 to 918 BCE. Asa began his reign as a minor, leaving the queen mother Maachah in control. Initially, she seemed determined to expand her idolatrous practices, but a revolution in the northern kingdom of Israel abruptly halted her ambitions, altering the political and religious trajectory. In the northern kingdom, Nadab had assumed the throne after Jeroboam's death in 955 BCE and waged war against the Philistines, besieging Gibbethon, a Danite city under Philistine control. During this campaign, a soldier named Baasha conspired and murdered King Nadab within the army camp. Baasha then marched to the capital city of Tirzah, destroyed the entire house of Jeroboam in 954 BCE, and claimed the throne for himself. Unlike Saul and David, the dynasty of Jeroboam had not been sanctified by prophetic anointment and thus was vulnerable to such acts. Baasha became the first in a line of regicides in the northern tribes, hastening the instability that would plague the region. He ruled from 954 to 933 BCE, retaining Tirzah as his capital for its central location and fortified position. Baasha could have gained the support of Judah by abolishing the worship of the golden calves, a prominent idolatrous practice, but he refrained. Asa, perceiving the threat posed by continued idolatry and fearing alignment with Israel, acted decisively. Either independently or under the counsel of a prophet, Asa seized the reins of government from his mother Maacah, banned the worship of Astarte, expelled the temple priestesses, and destroyed the idol she had erected in the valley of Kedron. Through these decisive actions, Asa secured the goodwill of the devout among his people. Conflict between the two kingdoms continued, as it had for decades. Asa is credited with capturing several cities in the territory of Ephraim, incorporating them into Judah. Baasha, seeking advantage, sought an alliance with the king of Egypt and encouraged Egyptian forces to attack Judah. An Egyptian general named Zerah, also called Osarkan, led a large army of Ethiopians and advanced as far as Mareshah, approximately 10 leagues southwest of Jerusalem. Asa met this threat with the combined forces of Judah and Benjamin, defeating the Ethiopian army north of Mareshah, pursuing it to Gerar, and bringing enormous spoils back to Jerusalem. Disheartened by Asa's victories, Baasha then sought the support of Ben-Hadad I, king of Damascus. Previously allied with Judah and protective against aggression, Ben-Hadad now broke his treaty with Asa and joined Baasha. Baasha captured and fortified Ramah, the birthplace and residence of the prophet Samuel, using it as a base for raids into neighboring districts. Alarmed, Asa moved swiftly to renew his alliance with the king of Damascus. He sent ambassadors with a large quantity of silver and gold taken from the temple and royal treasuries. Flattered by attention from both kingdoms, Ben-Hadad agreed to cooperate with Asa. He led a northern campaign into the territory of Israel, subjugating the cities of Ijon, Dan, and Abel-Beth-Maachah, and seizing lands around the Sea of Tiberias and the mountains of the tribe of Naphtali. Asa was thus spared from immediate conquest, while Baasha was forced to abandon his designs on Ramah, demonstrating the precarious balance of power and the intricate diplomacy of the period. King Asa of Judah, intent on securing his borders and eliminating the threat posed by the northern kingdom, summoned all men capable of bearing arms to assist in the destruction of the fortifications at Ramah, a strategic town near the northern frontier. The death of King Baasha of Israel in 933 before the Common Era, coupled with a revolution in the city of Tirzah, relieved Asa of immediate danger on that side. Recognizing the importance of defensible positions, Asa made the town of Mizpah into a fortified citadel, taking advantage of its elevated location, and he also constructed a deep and spacious cistern carved into the rocks to ensure a reliable water supply during any potential siege. Meanwhile, in the northern kingdom of Israel, turmoil engulfed the house of Baasha. Baasha was succeeded by his son Elah, who reigned from 933 to 932 before the Common Era. Elah, given over to idleness and indulgence in drink, neglected his kingly duties even as his army was engaged in battle against the Philistines at Gibbethon. Seizing the opportunity, the servant Zimri, the commander of half of the royal chariots left behind in Tirzah, assassinated King Elah in 932 before the Common Era. Zimri did not spare the family or allies of Baasha, extinguishing all rival claims and immediately claiming the throne for himself. However, his rule was extraordinarily brief, lasting only 7 days. The news of Elah's murder quickly reached the army besieging Gibbethon, who then elected Omri, the Israelite general, as their king. Omri marched on Tirzah to claim the throne but found the city gates closed against him. He laid siege to the capital, eventually breaching its walls. Zimri, realizing the inevitability of defeat, set the palace on fire and perished in the flames, becoming the third of 5 kings of Israel to die an unnatural death during this period. Only 2 of these rulers would later be buried in the royal mausoleum established by Jeroboam. Omri's claim to the throne, however, was not uncontested. Another faction within Tirzah had chosen Tibni, the son of Ginath, as king, possibly a native of Tirzah. Tibni drew the support of many citizens, setting the stage for a brutal civil war. For 3 years, From 932 to 928 before the Common Era, the rival factions clashed, spilling blood in the streets of Tirzah. Eventually, the forces loyal to Omri triumphed. Tibni was killed in the struggle, leaving Omri as the sole ruler in 928 before the Common Era. Finding Tirzah insecure, its palace burned, its population divided, and memories of the civil war fresh. Omri determined to establish a new capital. Shechem was unsuitable due to its rebellious history, so he purchased a high plateau northwest of Shechem from a man named Shemer. On the site, Omri built a fortified city, including a palace and other structures, and named it Shamron, known to history as Samaria. To populate the new capital, he likely settled loyal warriors and supporters, following a strategy reminiscent of David's settlement of Jerusalem. Within a year of consolidating his victory, Omri relocated his seat of power to Samaria, which would remain the political center of the northern kingdom of Israel for 2 centuries. The city's foundation intensified its historical enmity with Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah, and the land surrounding it came to be known as the land of Samaria. Omri, though not a warrior of exceptional prowess, was a shrewd and wise ruler. The crown had been acquired more by circumstance than by personal force, but he sought to strengthen his court, enhance his people's wealth, and restore prosperity reminiscent of the days of Solomon. Despite the division of Israel weakening the kingdom, Omri attempted to pursue peaceful relations with the house of David, reasoning that friendly ties would benefit both realms and perhaps restore influence over the territories that had once been tributary. For a period, this policy was successful, and the two kingdoms maintained amicable relations. Omri also looked outward to Phoenicia, the maritime kingdom along the eastern Mediterranean coast, hoping to share in the wealth generated by its extensive trade networks. Phoenicia at the time had suffered political instability, kings had been slain to secure the throne, and ethnic tensions had driven prominent families to emigrate and establish colonies along North Africa. Ethbal, also known as Ithabal, a priest of the goddess Astarte, had ascended to the throne of Tyre after the murder of his predecessor, Fals. Facing pressure from the kingdom of Damascus, which saw control of the productive Phoenician coastline, Ethbal sought alliances to strengthen his position. Recognizing common interests, Omri and Ethbal formed an offensive and defensive alliance, solidified through marriage. Omri's son, Ahab, married Ethbal's daughter Jezebel, a union that would prove to have catastrophic consequences for Israel. This alliance not only cemented ties with Tyre, but also introduced a potent foreign influence into the northern kingdom, setting the stage for religious and political conflicts that would dominate the region in the years to come. Omri, the king of Israel, fortified by the alliance he had formed, now ventured boldly into military campaigns to consolidate his power. He captured several towns in Moab, a kingdom that had previously asserted its independence under the reign of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and compelled it once again to pay tribute to Israel. The Moabites were forced to deliver herds of oxen and flocks of rams every year, acknowledging the authority of the Israelitish king. Yet Israel's growing strength aroused the envy of neighboring powers. Ben-Hadad I, king of Damascus, a state in Syria whose rulers were Arameans, declared war against Omri and succeeded in recapturing some of the cities Omri had seized. Omri, facing this challenge, was compelled to negotiate peace with Ben-Hadad on harsh terms. Among the conditions, Omri had to ensure that the caravan roads through the kingdom of Israel remained open and allow free passage through his territory. Seeking greater stability and influence, Omri turned toward the kingdom of Tyre, a prominent Phoenician city-state on the coast of the Mediterranean, and pursued a policy of cultural and religious assimilation. Omri asked himself why Israel should remain separate from its neighbors, who shared language and customs. He reasoned that by adopting the Phoenician form of worship, Israel could become more closely aligned with Tyre. To this end, Omri introduced the worship of Baal, the Phoenician god of storms and fertility, and Astarte, the Phoenician goddess of love and war, as the official religion of the kingdom. In his capital city of Samaria, Omri built a temple for Baal, appointed priests to officiate, and commanded that sacrifices be universally offered to these deities. He aimed to abolish the worship of the bull, which had been practiced at Bethel and Dan, because it retained a distinctly Israelitish character. Omri saw Jehovah, the God of Israel, with or without an image, as too stark a contrast to Baal or Adonis, and he sought to suppress the traditional worship of Israel. The religious innovations of Omri were far more sweeping and consequential than those of Jeroboam, his predecessor, and in the biblical account, his actions are described as more sinful. Omri's aim was to strip the Israelites of their God and their national identity, attempting to integrate them completely into the Phoenician cultural sphere. How the people received these changes is not fully recorded by history, but Omri's son, Ahab, who reigned from 922 to 901 before the Common Era, was destined to continue his father's program. Ahab maintained the alliance with Tyre and with the southern kingdom of Judah, pursuing the policies of his father. Yet the grand design to transform Israel into a mere extension of Phoenician culture depended not only on policy but on the disposition of the ruler and circumstances beyond human control. Ahab, unlike his father Omri, was mild, peace-loving, and disinclined to confront obstacles. He lacked a strong will and preferred comfort and leisure to confrontation. Where Omri had acted decisively and often ruthlessly, Ahab would have abandoned these measures if not compelled by external forces. He was neither warlike nor assertive, permitting neighboring kings to treat him with impunity, a passivity that would have been intolerable in any ruler sensitive to honor and national pride. Ahab's wife, Jezebel, a Phoenician princess whose father had served as priest of the goddess Astarte before ascending to the throne of Tyre, provided the energy and resolve that Ahab lacked. She was determined to continue Omri's plan of canonizing the Israelites, seeking either for political reasons or through personal zeal to unite the Israelitish people with her own Phoenician lineage. Jezebel's resolute and domineering character, her obsessive energy, and her readiness to employ cruelty and oppression guided the weak-minded Ahab into acts of tyranny. Her influence led to widespread ferment and unrest within the northern kingdom of Israel, creating tension and instability that, though destructive, ultimately served to purge opposition and consolidate the new religious and political order. Jezebel, the queen of Israel and wife of King Ahab, immediately set about reshaping the religious landscape of the northern kingdom. Her first step was the construction of a grand temple dedicated to the god Baal in the capital city of Samaria. Within this temple were 3 altars, statues, and sacred pillars, dedicated to a sort of Canaanite trinity: Baal, the god of storms and fertility; his consort, the goddess Astarte; and Moloch Chaman, the god associated with fire and destruction. To establish and maintain this worship, Jezebel brought into Israel a vast assembly of foreign priests and prophets, 450 devoted to Baal, and 400 to Astarte. These men were maintained at the expense of the royal house and often dined at the queen's own table. Some of these priests remained in Samaria to attend the sacrifices, while others roamed throughout the country, performing wild and scandalous rituals in the towns and villages. The Phoenician priests and prophets wore women's garments, painted their faces and eyes as women customarily did, bared their arms to the shoulders, and carried swords, axes, scourges, castanets, pipes, cymbals, and drums. They danced, wailed, spun in circles, bowed their heads to the ground, dragged their hair through the mud, bit their arms, and cut their own flesh with swords and knives, offering their blood to the bloodthirsty gods. Temple priestesses, called Kedishoth, followed these ceremonies, aiding the priests and honoring Astarte. Through this organized spectacle, Jezebel hoped to turn the people of Israel away from the worship of the God of their fathers and to transform the character of the nation entirely. At the head of the Phoenician priesthood stood a high priest, who issued instructions and commanded the conduct of the rituals. The altars of the God of Israel were destroyed, replaced by those in the Canaanite style, featuring pointed pillars that symbolized obscene rites. Altars in the cities of Bethel and Dan were likely transformed similarly. The aim was clear. By depriving the people of their traditional altars, they would be compelled to bring offerings to the temples of Baal and Astarte, becoming gradually accustomed to foreign modes of worship. The population of the 10 tribes of Israel had already been weakened by 50 years of separation from Jerusalem, the intellectual and religious center of the nation, and by the long practice of bull worship. Luxury and indulgence had taken root in the cities, and the impure worship of Baal and Astarte only encouraged these tendencies. Most towns submitted to these changes or offered no resistance. Only 7,000 individuals remained steadfast, refusing to pay homage to Baal or pronounce his name. Many villagers wavered, uncertain whether God or Baal held greater power, worshiping one openly and the other secretly. The kingdom teetered in confusion and uncertainty, a period that often precedes a historical crisis. In such a time, a man of extraordinary character, wholly devoted to his faith, naturally rises to leadership. By his firmness, courage, and self-sacrifice, he inspires the weak, strengthens the wavering, and gathers defenders to protect the nation's sacred traditions. In this crisis, such a figure appeared in the prophet Elijah, who lived from approximately 920 to 900 before the Common Era. His origins, tribe, and father's name were unknown. He was simply called Eliyahu, later shortened to Elijah. He was not a citizen of the Transjordanic region of Gilead, but belonged to the class of tolerated half-citizens known as Tashabim, dwellers within the land without full tribal privileges. Elijah's temperament was tempestuous. He acted with no regard for expediency and would not hesitate to sacrifice his own life for his faith. He was seen by his followers as the living embodiment of moral and religious zeal, known in Hebrew as Cana. Like a storm, he arrived suddenly, thundered his denunciations against King Ahab, whose rule was dominated by his weak and controlling wife Jezebel, moved swiftly and elusively so that no one could capture him, and vanished from the scene as suddenly as he appeared. Elijah dedicated his life entirely to preserving the belief in the God of Israel, which was threatened with extinction. Elijah's appearance was immediately recognizable by his austere dress. Unlike the effeminate, luxurious clothing of the worshippers of Baal and Astarte, Elijah wore a simple undergarment secured with a leather belt, and over it a black cloak made of coarse hair. He wore his hair long and abstained entirely from wine, thus establishing practices that would later define the Nazarites, a group forbidden to drink wine or cut their hair. It was in Gilead, near the Jordan River, where the threat of Ahab and Jezebel could not intimidate him, that Elijah first proclaimed the central creed of his mission, Jehovah alone is God. Here he found the first adherents and disciples among those who remained faithful to the God of Israel, drawn to his passionate and commanding presence, and who would become the first supporters of his extraordinary mission. In a short time, a devoted circle of prophets and disciples, known as the Bene Nebian, arose, men and women who were willing to give their lives for the preservation of Israel's ancestral laws and religious traditions. They followed the ascetic way of the prophet Elijah, the Tishbite of Gilead, adopting the life of Nazarites, marked by vows of self-restraint and simplicity. The principles of this new brotherhood were exacting. They would not dwell in cities, where luxury and indulgence threatened virtue, but would live in villages or temporary tents. They abstained from wine, avoided agriculture, and refrained from tilling the soil, preferring, like the patriarchs of old, to sustain themselves by tending flocks. Jonadab, the son of Rechab, who himself appears to have been a follower of Elijah, first codified these strict rules for his household. He impressed upon his descendants the necessity of avoiding wine, fixed dwellings, sowing seeds, and vineyards. In this way, Elijah not only inspired a group of defenders of the ancient law for his own era, but also paved the way for a future shaped by simplicity, discipline, and moral rigor. He set restraint against indulgence, devotion against decadence. With his followers, Elijah launched direct action against the priests and prophets of Baal. The Canaanites stormed God, traveling swiftly from place to place, summoning the people, and speaking with storm-like fervor, Jehovah alone is God, and Baal and Astarte are dumb, lifeless idols. In his zeal, he may have incited attacks upon those priests of Baal whom he encountered. Queen Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, the priest of Astarte, could not tolerate the Tishbites' influence. She sent soldiers to crush Elijah's followers, and those captured were ruthlessly slaughtered, becoming the first martyrs for Israel's ancient law. Jezebel's cruelty marked her as the first religious persecutor in the land, yet Elijah himself, the object of her most relentless vengeance, always eluded her grasp. Elijah's actions began to have a profound effect on the kingdom. Obadiah, the superintendent of King Ahab's palace and secretly loyal to Israel's ancestral faith, protected 100 prophets by hiding 50 in each of 2 caves on Mount Carmel, supplying them with bread and water. Obadiah was not alone in this, employing others of the same faith to carry out secret missions. How could Jezebel fight an invisible enemy, supported even from within her own palace? Elijah, though temporarily without his disciples, ventured close to King Ahab, whom he knew to be weak and pliable, to reproach him for the misdeeds he tolerated. Ahab, obsessed with building and fortifying towns, had restored the walls of Jericho, destroyed in the Israelite conquest through the labor of Hiel of Bethel. He also established a new capital in the fertile plain of Jezreel, where he wished to spend the winter months, as Samaria served only as a summer residence. The town of Jezreel was built in grandeur, with a palace of ivory and extensive gardens. The king desired a beautiful vineyard belonging to Naboth, one of Jezreel's most respected citizens, to embellish his palace grounds. He offered Naboth money or land in exchange, but Naboth refused, unwilling to part with the inheritance of his fathers. Anguished and unwilling to eat, King Ahab was mocked by Jezebel, who scorned his weakness and promised that he would yet obtain the vineyard. She sent letters in the king's name to compliant elders throughout Israel, instructing them to summon 2 witnesses to accuse Naboth of cursing God and the king. The elders convened, and Naboth, as the eldest among them, took his place at the head. 2 unscrupulous men, following Jezebel's orders, swore falsely against Naboth. The court condemned him to death, and the sentence was carried out upon him and his sons. By law, the vineyard fell to the king. Jezebel triumphantly declared, "Now take Naboth's vineyard, for he is dead." When Elijah heard of this atrocity, he could no longer restrain his anger. He went to Jezreel, arriving as Ahab inspected the vineyard. Behind him rode 2 men, one destined to become the avenger of Naboth. Elijah thundered to the king, "Hast thou murdered, and dost now take possession? In the place where dogs lick the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick thy blood, even thine." These words struck the king with awe and dread. He reflected, humbled, and performed penance, yet Jezebel's ruthless influence over him ensured that his repentance did not last. Elijah, having temporarily withdrawn, reappeared to deliver a new warning. A famine, lasting several years, would strike the land. He then withdrew to the Phoenician town of Zarephath, also called Sarepta, where he stayed with a widow, and later dwelt in a cave on Mount Carmel. During the famine, provisions became so scarce that even the king's horses lacked fodder. On one occasion, Elijah approached Obadiah, the palace superintendent, and commanded him to announce, "Elijah is here." When Ahab confronted him, he exclaimed, "Is it thou, disturber of Israel?" Elijah replied sharply, "Not I have troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house have." The prophet Elijah, known as the Tishbite from the region of Gilead, acted with a boldness that seemed to claim authority even over kings. He commanded King Ahab of Israel, the son of Omri, to summon all the priests of Baal to Mount Carmel, declaring that there the true God would be revealed in contrast to the false. Mount Carmel, a lofty ridge along the Mediterranean coast, became the stage for a confrontation that must have astonished all who witnessed it. King Ahab called together all the prophets of Baal, and a multitude of the people gathered, eager to see whether the prolonged drought afflicting the land would finally end, and to witness the outcome of this unprecedented contest between the prophet of the Lord and the priests of a foreign deity. The 100 prophets of Baal who had hidden in caves on Mount Carmel, maintained secretly by Obadiah, the steward of Ahab's household, were also likely present. Elijah addressed the assembly, speaking with a voice of authority. "How long halt ye between 2 opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." He then instructed the priests of Baal to build an altar, offer sacrifices, and call upon their God to demonstrate divine power. The priests complied, wounding themselves with knives and lances, and cried out from morning until midday, yet no response came. When their efforts failed, Elijah built an altar of 12 stones, poured water over the sacrifice to magnify the forthcoming miracle, and prayed quietly to the Lord. Instantly, fire descended from heaven, consuming the offering, the wood, and even the water in the trench surrounding the altar. Overcome with awe, all who were present fell upon their faces, crying out, "Jehovah alone is God." Elijah then commanded the crowd to seize the priests of Baal and put them to death, casting their bodies into the nearby Kishon River. King Ahab, though shocked, permitted this act, recognizing the overwhelming demonstration of divine authority. Queen Jezebel, however, was unyielding and vengeful. On learning what had transpired, she swore that Elijah would share the fate of the priest if he fell into her hands, forcing the prophet to flee for his life. In the wilderness near Mount Horeb, Elijah received a vision in which he was told that the dynasty of Ahab would be destroyed, that Jehu would rise as king over Israel, and that he himself was to appoint a successor before withdrawing from the political scene. His earlier zeal in ordering the execution of the priests of Baal was sternly rebuked in this vision, emphasizing restraint and divine timing. During Elijah's extended absence, a fragile truce appeared to develop between the house of Omri and the followers of the prophet. King Ahab, having witnessed the miracle at Carmel, seemed less devoted to Baal worship and sought to moderate the persecution of the Lord's prophets, while the prophets themselves became less aggressive, forming safe communities in Jericho, Bethel, and Gilgal. One prophet, Micaiah son of Imlah, however, remained openly critical of Ahab. Whenever the king sought counsel regarding military campaigns or political ventures, Micaiah predicted misfortune. Ahab, though angered, refrained from executing him, choosing only to imprison him temporarily. At the same time, the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad II, grew increasingly ambitious. He commanded a formidable army, reinforced by 32 vassal kings he had subjugated. and advanced upon Israel, exploiting the kingdom's famine and internal discord. Ben-Hadad conquered large swaths of territory and laid siege to Samaria in 904 before the Common Era. King Ahab, unable to resist fully, sued for peace, but Ben-Hadad imposed harsh terms, forcing Ahab to continue fighting. Eventually, Ahab achieved victory, compelling the Aramean king to sue for peace, and a treaty was concluded, sealed by oaths that were soon forgotten. Ben-Hadad, despite the treaty, refused to return all the captured territories, holding on to the strategically vital city of Ramoth-Gilead. Ahab, indecisive and passive, did not press his claims, allowing Ben-Hadad to regain strength over time. Recognizing the need for greater support, Ahab allied with King Jehoshaphat of Judah, who reigned from 918 to 905 before the Common Era. Though Jehoshaphat opposed the Baal worship imposed by Ahab and Jezebel and disapproved of their violent persecution of the prophets, he entered into a political alliance with the house of Omri. The arrangement was further cemented when Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram, married Athaliah, the idolatrous daughter of Ahab, demonstrating the intertwining of political expedience and familial bonds. When Jehoshaphat visited Samaria to strengthen ties with the northern king, Ahab solicited his assistance in recovering Ramoth-Gilead. Jehoshaphat agreed, bringing with him the armed forces of Judah, setting the stage for a joint military campaign against the Aramean king. The alliance, despite its uneasy moral compromises, represented a significant political maneuver in the complex interplay of kingdoms, prophets, and dynastic ambitions that defined this period in Israelite history. Thus, after a long, intense separation, the armies of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah fought side by side. King Ahab of Israel, accompanied by King Jehoshaphat of Judah, crossed the Jordan River to engage the Arameans at Ramoth-Gilead. In the heat of battle, while standing in his war chariot, Ahab was mortally wounded by an arrow. Despite the grievous injury, he retained sufficient presence of mind to command his charioteer to remove him from the chaos of combat. The soldiers, unaware of the king's critical condition, continued to fight valiantly until evening. Only after Ahab had bled to death was the herald sent to proclaim, "Let each return to his own country and to his own town." The armies of Israel and Judah recrossed the Jordan River, leaving the Arameans in control of the mountain city of Ramoth-Gilead. Ahab's body was brought to Samaria and interred, but the blood that had filled the chariot was washed away at a pool and licked by dogs. Ahab was succeeded by his son Ahaziah, marking the first instance in which the kingdom of the 10 tribes passed directly to a grandson. Ahaziah reigned only a short period, from the year 901 to 900 before the Common Era, and little is recorded of his character. Following the path of his parents, he persisted in evil deeds, ignoring warnings and counsel. After a fall from the window of his chamber, he confined himself to bed and sent emissaries to the city of Ekron, seeking the oracle of Baal-zebub, the reputed idol of the Philistines. At this time, the prophet Elijah, who had previously retreated to Mount Horeb to escape persecution, remained in seclusion, likely on Mount Carmel. He no longer directly interfered in worldly affairs, having chosen Elisha, son of Shaphat of Abel-Mahala near the Jordan River, as his successor. The selection of Elisha was emblematic of Elijah's prophetic ways. While Elisha was plowing a field with a yoke of oxen, Elijah approached, casting over him his dusky mantle, the distinctive garment of the prophets, as a sign of succession. Understanding the gravity of the moment, Elisha ran after Elijah, requesting leave to bid farewell to his parents. Elijah replied curtly, "Go, return," signaling that a true prophet of God must forsake father and mother, leaving personal attachments to serve divine purpose. Without returning home, Elisha immediately became Elijah's attendant, performing the ceremonial act of pouring water on his hands, a gesture of obedience and apprenticeship. Elijah's final public action occurred when he intercepted the messenger sent by Ahaziah to consult Baal-zebub. He rebuked the messenger, saying, "Is there no God in Israel, that thou sendest to Ekron to inquire of Baal-zebub concerning thine illness?" The messenger relayed Elijah's words to Ahaziah, who recognized the prophet and summoned him to Samaria. Elijah arrived and declared that the king would not rise from his sickness, and Ahaziah soon died childless, leaving the throne to his brother Jehoram, who reigned from 899 to 887 before the Common Era. Around the same time, Elijah disappeared from human sight. His disciples could not accept the mortality of his fiery spirit, and a belief arose that he had been taken up to heaven in a storm wind. Elisha, faithful to his master, followed him closely, observing Elijah's visits to Gilgal, Bethel, and Jericho, until they crossed the Jordan River on dry ground. At last, Elijah was withdrawn from Elisha's vision in a fiery chariot drawn by fiery horses, ascending to heaven in full view of his disciple. Elijah's tireless efforts to preserve the ancient law amidst the idolatry and oppression of Baal and Astarte worship could only be accounted for by divine intervention. His greatest achievement, however, lay in founding a circle of disciples who kept alive the teachings of the law, boldly confronting the moral corruption of the rulers. These disciples, working by their own labor, continued the prophetic tradition, and after Elijah's disappearance, Elisha assumed leadership. In the early years of his ministry, Elisha emulated his master, dwelling on Mount Carmel and remaining aloof from the people. Gradually, he engaged with the population, particularly after inspiring a determined man to destroy the house of Omri and end the worship of Baal. Jehoram, the third king of Omri's lineage, was less fanatical than his mother Jezebel in spreading idolatry, yet Elisha's aversion to him was so profound that he could not endure facing the king directly. Following the death of his brother, Jehoram of Israel undertook a military campaign against King Mesa of Moab to punish the secession and bring the territory back under Israelitish control. Jehoram allied with his brother-in-law, King Jehoshaphat of Judah, planning to advance through Edom south of the Dead Sea toward Moab. As they passed Jerusalem, the chief leaders of Israel and Judah met in a show of friendship, yet it remained a formal alliance. At the council of Jehoshaphat, Elisha, the prophet and successor of Elijah, was summoned to foretell the outcome of the campaign. Upon seeing Jehoram, Elisha spoke sharply, saying, "Were it not out of consideration for King Jehoshaphat, I would not look at thee. Go thou to the prophets of thy father and thy mother." Nevertheless, he prophesied a favorable result. King Mesa of Moab, awaiting the attack on his southern border, was overcome by the numerical superiority of the Israelitish and Judean forces. He fled to his mountain fortress at Kir-Hareseth, also known as Kir-Moab or Kerek. Though the land of Moab was devastated, Mesa was not fully subjugated. Soon after, with the death of King Jehoshaphat, Edom, the territory to the south of Judah, also withdrew its allegiance. It appears Edom had made a tacit agreement with King Mesa after the allied forces departed, betraying the alliance. The close ties of marriage and friendship between the houses of Omri and Israel and Jehoshaphat and Judah thus brought unforeseen misfortune to the house of David. Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat and namesake of his Israelitish brother-in-law, introduced idolatrous practices into Judah, further entangling the southern kingdom in the religious and political upheavals of the northern kingdom. There can be no doubt that Queen Athaliah, wife of King Jehoram of Judah, was the cause of the persistent idolatry in the southern kingdom, for she, like her mother Jezebel, was fanatically devoted to the disgraceful rites of Baal worship. Her influence ensured that the malignant legacy of the house of Omri, Jezebel's dynasty in the northern kingdom of Israel, would entangle the house of David in its perilous meshes. The prophet Elisha, successor of Elijah, guided the unfolding of this destiny with unwavering purpose. At that time, Damascus experienced a sudden change of dynasty. Ben-Hadad II, who had previously waged war against King Ahab of Israel, was suffocated by his trusted servant Hazael, who seized the throne. Hazael, ambitious to reclaim territories lost by his predecessor, first directed his attacks against the tribes of Israel located on the eastern side of the Jordan River. King Jehoram of Israel, also known as Joram, marched with his army to Ramoth-Gilead, a strategic fortress of great importance, to defend it against the Aramean incursions. The contest for Ramoth-Gilead was fierce, and during the battle King Jehoram was struck by an arrow, leaving him gravely wounded. He retreated to Jezreel to have his injury attended to, leaving a trusted captain, Jehu, in command of the fortress. It was then that a disciple of the prophets arrived, sent by Elisha. He led Jehu away from the council of Israelite commanders to a private chamber, and secretly anointed him as the chosen instrument of divine justice against the house of Omri. The messenger vanished as abruptly as he had come, leaving Jehu in a state of divine inspiration. Upon returning to the council, Jehu initially withheld the revelation, but finally he disclosed that he had been anointed king over the 10 tribes of Israel by Elisha's direction. The army chiefs immediately recognized his authority. They spread their purple garments upon the high steps of the palace to form an improvised throne, and amid the sound of trumpets, they shouted, "Long life King Jehu!" Acknowledged as king by the army, Jehu moved swiftly to execute his divinely ordained mission. He blocked all roads from Ramoth-Gilead to Jezreel to prevent news from spreading, and then led part of the army across the Jordan River with haste to Jezreel, where King Jehoram lay weakened by his wound. From a distance, Jehoram recognized Jehu by his urgent approach, and the absence of the messenger he had sent to meet him filled him with foreboding. King Jehoram ordered his chariot to advance to meet Jehu, accompanied by his nephew Ahaziah, who had recently ascended the throne of Judah in 888 before the Common Era. They met Jehu in the field of Naboth, the vineyard owner whose judicial murder under Jezebel's instigation had become notorious. Seeing Jehu's hostile advance, Jehoram attempted to flee, but Jehu loosed an arrow that struck him down, and he fell lifeless in his chariot. Jehu then commanded his follower Bidkar to cast Jehoram's body into the field of Naboth, reminding him of the prophetic words of Elijah, which were now fulfilled through their actions. On the same day, King Ahaziah of Judah also fell at the hands of Jehu's followers. The annihilation of the house of Ahab was now imminent. Jehu entered Jezreel unopposed. From a palace window, Queen Jezebel, richly adorned in the height of Phoenician luxury, confronted him, calling mockingly, "How goes it, thou regicide, thou Zimri?" Jehu commanded the eunuchs of the palace to throw her from the window, and they obeyed. Jezebel's body was trampled under the hooves of horses, and her blood spattered the walls of the palace. Yet Naboth's vengeance was not yet complete. Approximately 70 of Ahab's descendants' sons, grandsons, and other relatives still resided in Samaria, trained and educated by the most respected men of the kingdom. Jehu sent a message demanding they appoint a member of the royal family as king, but they understood the futility of the demand and chose to submit to Jehu's authority. He ordered them to bring their heads to Jezreel, and they complied. Jehu arranged the heads in 2 rows at the city gates and explained to the inhabitants that the prophecy of Elijah against the house of Ahab was now fulfilled. He executed all officers who had assisted him in bringing the victims, claiming justice upon murderers, and seized the throne unopposed. The people of Jezreel paid homage, recognizing him as king. To consolidate his rule and win the hearts of the people, Jehu turned against the worship of Baal in Samaria. Accompanied by Jonadab, a supporter of the Nazirite practices introduced by Elijah, he traveled to Samaria and assembled the priests of Baal. Feigning participation in their rites, he positioned armed men inside and outside the temple of Baal. The moment a sacrifice was offered, the soldiers struck. Those inside the temple were slain, and those attempting to flee were cut down by men stationed outside. The soldiers then destroyed the temple itself, burning the images, dismantling the altar and columns, and reducing the site to a heap of rubble. Throughout the northern kingdom, Jehu demolished the monuments of Baal worship, proclaiming himself a follower of Elijah and a servant of Jehovah. In Jerusalem, however, the worship of Baal persisted. Athaliah, queen of Judah and daughter of Jezebel, fanatically upheld the religion of her mother, maintaining a center of idolatrous devotion even as Jehu purged the northern kingdom.